morning, everyone. Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded over this land. It is wonderful to have the opportunity, and I thank you for the invitation to be part of your annual general meeting. As a social worker who has spent my entire working life and volunteer life in the not-for-profit community sector, I have a deep and personal appreciation of the work that VCOS does. And on that note, I'd like to thank all the board members, the CEO, the staff who do such incredible work, the outgoing board members and the incoming board members as well. We wish you all the very best and acknowledge my fellow panellists as well. Over my time as a social worker, I've seen our community sector change. From starting out as a young social worker at Odyssey House, a drug and alcohol rehabilitation service, to moving to settlement services for new migrants from refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds. I saw, from my vantage point, was a change from a time when it felt like we could advocate more freely and more strongly on behalf of the communities we worked with, even if it did challenge government policy very strongly. I saw more and more the encroachment of those subtle contract conditions, often not so subtle contract conditions, that became explicit and strategic attacks on the voice and role of civil society. I was absolutely dismayed, and I'll never forget that moment when one of my staff members and colleagues told me that they'd heard of stories of workers, their colleagues in other agencies, being threatened because of comments they'd made on social media that were critical of the government's policy at that time and continuing of locking up children in offshore detention camps, the punitive policy that we have seen towards asylum seekers and refugees, and their jobs and their roles and their working conditions were threatened because of their private comments. And so my staff, colleagues and our entire agency started to become more scared about everything we did and didn't say. I spoke earlier this year at your conference about how we have seen this played out at a state government level as well. And the issue of public housing has demonstrated for us most strongly and most recently how important this issue is, and public housing essentially, and the issue and how it's played out sums up this election for the Greens. Both the Labor and Liberal parties have neglected public housing for decades, so much so that we are in the midst of a crisis unlike anything that we have seen before. We have a waiting list of over 80,000 people waiting for public housing in immediate and urgent need of safe, secure and affordable housing. Over 25,000 of those are children. We have seen the politics of scarcity used from this government to argue that it cannot commit to funding the type of public housing build that we desperately need. We have been so concerned about that growing waiting list and the default response of turning to the private sector, even though it means gutting our chance of building more public housing if the only land we have to build more public housing is sold off to private developers, a once-in-a-generation mistake that you can never recover from. I encourage and urge our community sector to not stay quiet when poor policy decisions are made. We have a moral and ethical and professional responsibility to speak out when needed. And we have seen the impact of this advocacy in very positive ways. With a community campaign run by grassroots groups, public housing tenants and supportive and allied community members, supported by the Greens in Parliament, we have seen a shift, albeit a small one, with a recent announcement by the government to build 1,000 new public homes over the next few years. Housing is a right, and it is a fundamental role and responsibility of governments to provide safe, secure and affordable housing for all of its citizens. Having worked at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, I experienced what it was like also not to have the shackles of government contracts on every bit of work that you did. And we saw the impact of that and value of that when we could sit very strongly at that advocacy table, bringing the stories of our clients and communities to every conversation we had about future policy. Our sector has a big role in helping our community stay connected and strong, and this is especially important at this time in light of the tragic events we saw last week. Now is a time to be connected, not divided, and it was so disappointing to hear political leaders already using the language of division, fanning flames of hatred and pitting people against each other. The Greens are going into this election with hope and optimism. We have a plan for livable communities, powered by 100% renewable energy, connected by world-class public transport. A Victoria where people are cared for rather than corporate interests protected. We have ambitious plans for Victoria where together we can build a future for all of us. And what this means in the area of housing is building 40,000 new public housing dwellings over the next 6 years, with a further 40,000 community, affordable and public homes in the following 6 years. We might hear the usual critique that it's impossible, but we make no apology for this ambitious agenda. Even if we don't get to that full amount, by embarking on that agenda, you will achieve so much more than anyone else has put on the table. And it's critical for some of our most vulnerable communities that we do not shy away from the ambition that's needed to create the type of change that is so desperately needed. In terms of energy prices, we have seen the privatisation of energy being a disaster in Victoria. It's the story of privatisation of essential services everywhere, where the community loses and the governments become impotent in the face of corporate power. And yet here, the Labor Party and the Liberals are at one on privatising our essential services, key assets and our key public places. The Greens have a plan for a publicly owned retailer, which is the only way to guarantee lower energy prices and building more renewable energy, looking after renters and homeowners and looking after our most vulnerable, which is why our plan also addresses getting more solar power onto our public housing homes. In terms of mental health, Victoria is the lowest spending state on mental health services, and there is no excuse for this. The Greens welcome the commitment of holding a Royal Commission into mental health. There are so many systemic issues that need to be brought to light, and we will advocate strongly for the recommendations of such a Royal Commission to be implemented. But we don't need a Royal Commission to tell us the system is radically underfunded and that the rolling of mental health funds into the NDIS by the Andrews government was a mistake. Our policy is to commit $270 million over the next 4 years to redress these gaps. We have to have a strong mental health system if we are going to have a supportive and caring community for all of us. In terms of disability, we know that the NDIS is a game changer, but its implementation must be closely scrutinised. I was pleased to be joined recently by Greens Senator Jordan Steelejohn to announce our policy on disability services. Jordan is such a fierce advocate for people with disabilities in and out of federal parliament. Our policy is to commit $100 million to fill the gaps that we are seeing emerging in Victoria with the NDIS rollout, and that's on top of the $217 million for mental health funding, to transform our public transport system, to make it accessible for all, and to ensure that our built environment and our private built environment is accessible for everyone. We also want communities free from violence and are committed to implementing and funding the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Family Violence. In conclusion, I wanted to talk to you all about the Greens' commitments to a fair and equal society for everyone. I entered politics to help create systemic and structural change, the type of change that we need to see if we are going to fundamentally address inequality and disadvantage and create social justice for all. We are committed to helping create a Victoria that looks after all of us so that we can have a future in Victoria for all of us. Thanks, everyone.